Productive employees are good employees, right? Throughout much of the industrial age, productivity was one of our golden measures. But as we've shifted away from a focus on optimization, how does that change how we look at productivity? And how has the pandemic thrown a wrench into all of this? On today's episode of the Digital Experience Revolution, we'll talk with Frank Wander, CEO of PeopleProductive, and try to get to the bottom of all of this, how technology might be helping to solve the mess it helped create, and more. Stay with us. All right, Frank. Well, other than the fact that I know I'm just going to be all a mess with two Franks on the show today, I'm super excited about today's show because Frank Wander is one of my favorite people. I think he certainly with all of us, we just sort of share this mind meld of how we see the world, particularly within the enterprise and what it means to be a leader in that world. And so we're going to dive into a topic, as you might guess, based on the name of his company, that I think is really critical for enterprise leaders to understand, and that is productivity in a post-optimization world. One of the central tenets of our research has been that the nature of value has shifted from optimization to the customer experience. And one of the key elements of that optimization was a huge push towards employee productivity. So the question is, how does all this align in a world, assuming that we're correct, in which we start valuing things like imagination, creativity, and empathy, that at least on the surface can seem to be the antithesis of productivity, right, Frank? I mean, doesn't that seem to make sense?
Yeah, it does. And we'll talk a little bit later in the show about, productivity in this pandemic world and how, we've collected some data as well on what productivity looks like and how we are allegedly more productive now than we were before the pandemic. So, yes, it's an interesting time.
Well, and it is interesting, and I know not to give away the thunder, but we've done some what we call snapshot research that is showing some of this. But there's an interesting article just from less than a month ago, I guess, in the New York Times, talking about this very subject, about the fact that are we seeing this work from home productivity increase? And so I think it's just a big question mark, right? Does the pandemic affect all of this? Are we looking at it right? And so that's really what we wanted to find out. So we're turning to Frank Wander. And Frank, if you aren't familiar with his work, you need to check it out. He's the CEO of a company called PeopleProductive, and he's a world-renowned expert on this subject. Frank, thank you for joining us on the Digital Experience Revolution.
Happy to be here, as always. Anytime, Charlie. You run always the best shows and are just a natural at this.
Oh, flattery will get you everywhere. So, all right, let's dive in and start here. When we talk about productivity in the workplace today, does it mean the same thing as it did a decade ago, or are we looking at productivity differently in some way?
Productivity, I think, has really changed dramatically for a number of reasons. The first and foremost reason is that we never managed human productivity very well at any time. It was all about machine output. And, we ended up with a situation where, the lessons learned from the industrial era about counting yield and all these other things coming off assembly lines just don't really work and apply to the human side of business. It's very, very different. In the industrial era, productivity is output driven. And in the digital era, where humans are the tools, productivity is input driven. How much do they know? How many connections do you have? It's the world, being connected into this world around you. So it's completely different. And the metrics and measurements just really didn't exist for people to manage human productivity.
So I'm curious about that, though. I mean, certainly there's a whole lot of folks that have gone through the years, sold solutions, software, whatever, that purported to measure and manage human productivity. Are you saying that they, even in the industrial age, they didn't work?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at solutions like Salesforce.com, they're process-based solutions. We're going to have a pipeline and, we're going to set these goals and objectives. We're going to manage, how many contacts you have, how many appointments you actually made, how many deals you brought to the final stage of the contract. I don't think that's necessarily productivity. That is work management in a way.
So let's double click on one thing you said really quick. You mentioned that human productivity is input driven, and that's interesting. And it's funny, in all the conversations you and I have had on camera, off camera over the years, I don't know that I've ever captured that from you. So dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I was going to ask that question. It was very intriguing, Frank.
Yeah, I mean, I came to this conclusion years ago as I began to really look at what was it that was actually making people highly productive. And, the whole human emotion about the behaviors going on around them and these inputs that they're receiving are determining whether or not their emotional needs are being met. So they're in a toxic environment, they've got negative inputs, perhaps their limbic system goes off, they're not feeling safe in the workplace, maybe they feel, emotionally threatened. And that tends to shut down, the worker. You can look at all the other inputs, the amount of knowledge they need, the amount of training they need. So you go through for that human equipment to work really well. And I don't like calling humans equipment, but since we're in this, discussion, humans are in fact the most important tool of the digital era. I think we can all agree to that. That's come to the forefront. That wasn't the case 10 years ago at all. So human capital is where it's at, not financial capital. And that's the really big change that we've seen happen.
So I think that's a great segue then into, something that we believe, the research that Frank Granito and I are really focused on is this whole idea that in the digital era, it is about the humanist. It's about unleashing creativity, imagination, and empathy. And so one of the things that at least sort of rattles around in my head is, does that somehow run counter to this idea of productivity? And it sounds like what you said, I think I'm going to predict the answer is no, but I'm curious, if that's true and why. How do you see that?
It's everything, actually. It is the key to productivity. Empathy is, of course, one of the inputs. And, it forms much, much deeper connections with people. These are the things that really matter, because what you're trying to do when you want to performance engineer a culture to produce better, and you've got all these people and you need to bring them together, the degree to which leaders are modeling the right behaviors for the organization, which are all inputs for people, are vitally important. The degree to which people are forming and building relationships, being open and honest, vulnerable with one another, these things really matter. So social collaboration is a key driver. Then you want to really get people running on 8 cylinders, not 4, maybe even 2. So what we're dealing with here is organizational energy. You've got to be able to lead, inspire, and really drive the level of organizational energy up. Then we know, that when people have passion about their work, when they're working in an environment where the mood is really good, they live off of that mood because it's contagious. And that energy, is another input into the whole equation. And, then you get down to enablement, organizational enablement. How well are the processes defined? What is the work environment like? Am I interrupted constantly? Do I have any think time so that we can create and innovate around here? Do people have the knowledge competencies they need to do those jobs? These things really, really matter. And all of that eventually leads to innovation and adaptability, because people want speed. Well, you get speed by improving the speed of interaction, the amount of organizational energy that people are bringing to the job, ultimately unlocking innovation, enabling the place so that people aren't really jumping over hurdles to get their job done. People talk about agility and they're not even really managing all these things yet. We've got data from over 300 companies, and our human performance engineering model shows that the cultures that drive business performance are hitting on all these cylinders.
So I love it. So if I'm hearing you right, basically the very things that I would talk about why you need to do these things to unleash this humanness are actually the same things you're talking about that actually drive human productivity and performance.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up on that, Frank. Mm-hmm. You alluded to, these human as inputs and all the things you talked about leading to creativity and innovation, and mm-hmm. kind of got there. I'd like you to, if you could, expand a little bit on how we can actually, or if we can, measure the human input to the success of the organization? What's the relationship there? So I can like follow that breadcrumb, if you will.
Yeah. Well, we know from the work on engagement over the years that companies where the employees were engaged or emotionally attached to the work they were doing in the company,
Mm-hmm.
they did perform better, and it always showed up in the results. So
Excellent.
that was an indicator, but not the root cause. The root cause is happening at a lower level, right? It's all these enabling factors, all the positive motivation and the passion, the mood, all of these things can be orchestrated. And in fact, you have to orchestrate them. So that leads to absolutely people working better together. And when you unlock all of these large pools of untapped talent potential that lie around these companies and you bring it to life, and then, the cross-functional barriers start to come down,
Right.
and ideas flow. And those ideas get turned into solutions much quicker because there's more energy, they're moving faster, they're jumping over fewer hurdles, right? People are getting to the truth in a meeting because they're able to speak up and not be afraid of, retribution or being put down. All of those things used to happen in the industrial regularly. People manage machines. The human element did not matter.
So I think it's a great segue, because the pandemic that we're all still living through here has thrown, people call it the greatest work from home experiment the world has ever seen. And it has thrown organizational dynamics and cultures into turmoil. And so I'm curious, Frank, what do you see? How's the pandemic affected this idea of productivity? Is it positive, negative, neutral? I mean, how are you seeing the impact?
Companies are more concerned than ever about the productivity of their people. And I think there was a comforting factor when they all showed up in the office and they could see a lot of motion and activity. Now, they weren't managing any of it, probably. In many cases, they're probably disempowering the people. But the fact it was happening around them and there was a vibe to the place and lots of meetings going on, they took comfort in the fact things were getting done, even if they couldn't measure it. The reality is, when it's out, people are out of sight, out of mind. You sit there going, I wonder what they're doing all day long. Are they busy? And this really gets down to, if you really were leading people well, if you trusted them and you didn't need to micromanage, and they were delivering fine, then you had a good culture. Good cultures are going to be even more dominant than they were before, because all the weaknesses that were in existence in these very poorly engineered cultures are going to magnify themselves. And individuals may very well say, hey, I'm feeling, more productive. God, I'm not exhausted. I don't have to go commute 2 hours to get where I'm going. I'm not fighting traffic. That's more energy that they have to tap into work-related activities. And I think on an individual level, people are probably feeling better. The answer is going to be, is the company moving faster or slower? Are they innovating better than before? Are things falling behind? It's going to show up on the long term. It's not about the individual. And this era was never about the individual. It was always about the collective. When was the last time somebody really innovated something really important alone in a company and brought it to market? It just doesn't happen.
Yeah. Hey, Frank, I'm going to throw you a curveball, because it kind of, we're talking about enabling technologies, and this is the greatest work from home experiment or work from remote experiment. If we look at social media today, people seem to be very free with their comments behind the keyboard that they wouldn't normally be in person. We feel sort of empowered at the keyboard because we don't actually have to face somebody and have the consequences of what we say really directly at us. Do you think that the remote workforce, or working more remotely, has empowered this kind of openness and creativity, because people now feel that they can say what they want without fear of immediate face-to-face rejection? That's kind of I'm working on that hypothesis. What do you think?
Well, I'll tell you what, the psychology would say that without question,
Yeah.
that people are more willing to speak up. And we've seen that in many instances. They did an interesting study, I don't know, maybe it was 20 years ago, I read about it, where a guy put a stack of newspapers at a train station, and he had, a jar there. It was 50 cents honor system, and something like 3/4 of the papers were stolen. And then, he ran that for a few days, got the number, and then he put a large mirror behind the newspapers and the box. And the number of papers being stolen dropped to 50% because somebody was watching, even if it was only themselves.
Wow.
So when people are seen, they behave differently. It's called self-monitoring. People are self-monitors, and
Yeah.
they really don't want to be seen doing something that's not right. But if they could do it anonymously, sure.
Right. And sometimes those things lead to innovation. You might not do it in front of somebody, but some of those gray areas where you might get admonished, you feel free to do that. And that's sometimes what leads to a good deal of innovation and productivity. That's fascinating study.
Yeah, both ways.
Yeah.
So, all right. So, as we wrap this up, Frank, what's next? Right? Is our audience is enterprise leaders who are trying to kind of break free of the shackles of the industrial age and lead their organizations into the future. So, when we think about creating a productive workforce, what should they be thinking about? How should they be leading this forward? And how do you help them? Maybe in terms of what
Sure.
you do.
Well, we're a human performance engineering company, so all the human factors that drive productivity. And by the way, productivity in this era is making work easier. You're removing all of this negativity, friction, all of these hurdles. You're getting people to work together and mesh in a much better way. So productivity is a very, very good thing. It's more fluid. You'd love to have the whole organization in a state of flow, actually. Really just moving kind of freely, thinking freely, speaking freely. That's the ultimate. But look, it's an era where this will be kind of a very big determining factor. At the end of the day, culture is, it's a weighing machine, right? It's not a voting machine, it's a weighing machine, because it's whether the business makes it or not. How innovative do you become? The companies that win are going to be the ones who master the human side of business, who build the skills and competencies for an era where people are the most important tool. They're going to have to be able to measure it. We measure all the factors that drive it. They have to measure it, and they have to continuously improve it, just like they did with Six Sigma on their processes. It's the human side of business. It's the same discipline, but this time it's a different set of measurements and a different set of skills. And I think companies have focused on getting people to work better together, but there's a lot more to the productivity equation. And those are the areas where they lag in. The good companies who have leaders that just innately get this, they have high aptitude in this area. They've done it, but I think that they're really dependent on those leaders, because it's not a set of measurements that are driving it, and a set of skills and competencies that are being continuously improved. It's people who are very good at this, leading it in a very competent way, making it a strategic priority, and having the power to do it. And that's what's got to happen.
Fabulous stuff. So if people want to learn more, maybe read some of your content or learn more about what you guys do as an organization, where can they go?
They can go to www.peopleproductive.com.
Just like it sounds, People Productive?
Yeah, People Productive, yeah. Easy.
Great domain name. All right.
Yeah.
Very good. Frank, thank you so much for being with us today. We've really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure everyone got a lot from it.
Absolutely. Happy to be on. A great topic and very timely and important.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that was fabulous. I always enjoy my conversations with Frank Wander. I mean, Frank, what did you think?
Well, Frank Wander, I met him about 2013, 14, because we were both into culture, and it was a fascinating conversation then. And I loved how we talked about productivity and new ways to measure productivity, humans as input. That was absolutely fascinating. And just from the Institute's perspective, we do snapshot research, very small sample size, but we found that 79% of respondents strongly agree that their companies are working effectively with a remote workforce, and 2 out of every 3 respondents agree or strongly agree that they're more productive at home, or working remotely. So that's also fascinating. So that all ties in with Frank's
It's
comment.
interesting to me because I think the conversation with Frank Wander helped sort of clarify why that is, right? I mean, it's one of those things where I know when you gave me those numbers from the snapshot research, I sort of said, yeah, well, duh, it was like, obviously. But I think what's interesting is when Frank was talking about productivity and how it's fundamentally different in the digital era when it's all about these inputs, that it starts to make sense. And even where people who aren't as productive at home, it also makes sense in that context, right? It sort of provided that, to me anyway, the clarity as to the why all that was true.
And a remote workforce has never been a technology problem. It's always been a management problem. And I think the conversation with Frank, emphasized that, because you're going to have people who are, if they're not productive at home, they're not going to be productive in the office because somebody's happens to be watching. So interesting conversation. And also the idea of innovation being driven by collaboration, communication, transparency. These are all classic good cultural habits that were reinforced here.
Yep, solidified a lot of what we're working on and how it all connects. So great stuff.
Yeah.
So with that, it is time to move on. And now it's time for Tech Connection, where we look at the technology sector and how companies are filling in the holes, helping enterprises develop these business capabilities by bringing the technical capabilities and the technologies that they need to do so. Today, we're going to talk about a company called Clockwise. And I wrote this in my notes. I'm not sure this is their tagline, but if it isn't, it should be free marketing advice for Clockwise. And it's making time for what matters. I think that is their tagline, actually. But, I love what they're doing. So the founders of the company discovered this interesting dynamic that, frankly, when I spoke to them, Frank, I hadn't really processed it this way. But what they said is that, ironically, as work has become more networked, more interconnected, more collaborative, all the stuff that we talk about, for instance, in the digital enterprise readiness framework, right? That it actually is making it harder to get time to get things done, specifically the things that require focus or this energy, right? Because we're so interconnected that, part of it's the negative, the death by meeting, but a lot of it is just we have to work with so many other people that this focus time is hard. And so he told the story about how that their founders were finding that they were spending all this time working outside of work, at home, in the evenings, whatever, just to actually get the work done. And that not only was it hurting productivity, but that it was hurting morale. And so, the conversation we just had with Frank Wander, we start to see all these lines connect, right? That it's being able to do the things that are meaningful and important. And so they realized that technology was part of the problem, right? The technology, all this interconnectedness, and this ability of us to be always on was actually making it harder for us to achieve this sort of state of Zen or whatever, this flow, to be able to get this important work done. But at the same time, they saw, hey, maybe this technology can help create a solution if they applied automation and algorithms the way they were to these other projects they were working on. What if they applied them to the calendar and time management? And so they came up with this mission to help people make time for what matters, and that's basically what their software is. So before I dive into the actual software, I'm just curious of your reaction to any of that, Frank.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the conversation with Frank really emphasized, Frank Wander, that is, really emphasized this, where unleashing the power of the human. The human is the input, and by working remotely, we can now, ergo, have this really good work-life balance. In other words, work when we want to or work when we need to. And so the paradox there is the personal time, work time becomes very gray. You can't just turn it off. It's not 5 o'clock and you hit the commuter rail and you go home. Now you're as you said, you're always on. So now we have to have a calendar for life. It's not a work calendar and take out the trash calendar. It's like a calendar for everything that you're about. And a couple of years ago, I wrote this short piece for the Digital Era Now on our Institute for Digital Transformation site on the concept of presenteeism. So presenteeism used to be you went to work sick and you were unproductive. In the digital environment, presenteeism is I'm there, but I'm not because I'm distracted by technology. In other words, wherever you are, you have the ability to be somewhere else. So now I have this ability to be everywhere all the time. How do I make time for what matters? And hence, Clockwise.
Yeah. So what is it? So let's dive into exactly what the product is. It's basically an automated management layer that connects to existing corporate calendars. They're starting with Google G Suite, but I believe Office 365 is in the works. And what's interesting is it has sort of two layers or like two levels up. All right, the first is even if you're just using it by yourself, it can help you manage your time because it does things like automatically account for travel time. So sort of what you were talking about, Frank, right? You can sort of plug in how you want to function, and it will help you manage that. It will suggest optimal booking slots. It will use color coding automatically to visualize, use machine learning for this, what's important to you, etc. And then when you combine it with a team, if you have an entire team or a cluster of people that are using it together, then suddenly it starts growing exponentially in terms of value because they have this function called autopilot, which automatically works with the calendars to find and shift meetings around. So if I have a meeting that is important but not a priority, meaning it can be moved without any impact, and you're trying to find focus time, it will automatically shift things to clear space. And it's like, that is so flipping amazing. Plus it does things like account for time zones, and even like, hey, I like to do lunch at 2 o'clock because I'm weird, or whatever, right? You can kind of put all this in, and it crunches all this to try to optimize your calendar to give that space. So it was really, really fascinating software to me.
The way it struck me was almost like project management for your calendar, where you disconnect and connect tasks or calendar events that are not necessarily dependent on each other, and you can remove those contingencies and make your calendar flow almost like a PERT diagram would flow in a project management workflow. And that's the way it appeared to me, and I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great use of using intelligence to help us as humans solve a problem that's stopping us from being human, right? Because we end up just going through these motions. So one of the things I think is important, and in fact, I asked them when we were chatting about this, and that is, I said, well, how much of this is a cultural issue? And they acknowledge that the software alone isn't going to make people more productive, to Frank Wander's points earlier, right? And it's that if you're going to create a culture of innovation and creativity, that's still a cultural thing that has to happen. But what they do feel, and I agreed with them, is that the barrier that organizations may want to create that culture, but they start running smack into the fact that they're in back-to-back meetings, right? And so it's a tool for an organization that wants to make this cultural shift to start enabling it. And I thought that was really, really a cool answer.
Yeah, very interesting.
So in the end, I think that their big pitch is it's all about transparency and communication and focusing on the real work that generates real value. And I think that from the perspective of our research and how we look at it, we would certainly share that opinion. So I think that's a great segue, Frank, into the research connection. How do you see all of this that we've been talking about with both Frank Wander and with what Clockwise is doing in this big bucket of productivity and human productivity? How are you seeing this apply to our research?
Well, quite obviously, it sits very, very tightly in the digital experience supply chain with the transformation of work element, where technologies enable us to be interdependent almost on an exponential way, but in a more subtle way, it also ties in with the experience monitoring and management, where digital technologies enable the crucial element, but also important technologies enable us to be anywhere. As I said earlier in our discussion, the experience monitoring management, where we can be innovative, but we can be innovative anywhere. We can change organizations or alter organization flows being anywhere. So a couple of different spaces where this ties in very neatly with our research. Obviously, in the transformation of work, because now we're working remotely with these tools, and also in experience monitoring and management, where we can alter our workflows very, very easily. So that's how these technologies fit into that.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I see this as, on the one hand, productivity clearly, is about the transformation of work. When we were talking to Frank Wander, and he was going on about that it's all about these things about how you improve productivity. I said, well, those are the exact same things you need to do if you want to unleash humanness, right? That they're so intertwined as we're trying to make these human characteristics the driver of value. But I think you're also right. I mean, this whole idea of focusing on the inputs as that source of change, not only from an employee perspective, I think was interesting, but to your point, that's also the same thing really from an employee or from a customer experience perspective, right? It's not just the employee experience that's impacted by this,
Right.
the customer experience as we see this. So that when we talk about experience management and monitoring, and productivity ends up driving that shift, right? The more productive we are in the right way, then the happier we are, the better outlook we're going to have, the better the culture is going to be. It's all going to affect the experience. And so it is really fascinating how this is one of those things that threads sort of through everything.
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit about it on a previous show, and at least I alluded to it. If you're an old athlete and you're playing tight, you're not going to play very productively. But if you're playing loose and with nobody looking over your shoulder and judging you, when you play loose, good things happen. So same kind of metaphor applies here, I think.
Well, that is it for today's episode of the Digital Experience Revolution. If you're enjoying the show, make sure to click like and to subscribe using your favorite podcast app or on YouTube if you're watching the video. If you work for a tech company and believe that your solution can help digital leaders build and support the business capabilities they need, we'd love to hear from you. And for all you digital leaders out there, just remember, it's up to you to be the leader that your organization needs. Go be it.